And welcome to the Global Mapper webinar for the month of July. My name is Josie McKnight, Application Specialist here at Blue Marble Geographics, and with me today is David McKittrick.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar.
The topic of today's webinar is using GeoCalc in Global Mapper version 15, and over the next hour we'll be exploring the integration of the advanced projection management capabilities of Geographic Calculator into the Global Mapper platform.
Yeah, that's right. Just under a year ago, when we released Global Mapper 15, we developed an integrated component that allowed you to use the GeoCalc mode in Global Mapper. This basically allowed you to perform advanced projection, datum, coordinate system management within the application. We are going to be covering that today from the context of Global Mapper. Those of you who were able to attend last week's webinar, Sam Knight introduced some of the administrative capabilities in Geographic Calculator, Global Mapper's other major application. We're going to talk today about how those settings, those administrative settings, and the other tools can be applied in Global Mapper. Just by way of introduction, I'm just noting a lot of people are still signing up or still signing in today. A quick show of hands of those of you who are in attendance. How many of you were able to attend last week's webinar? Now, the show of hands button is in your go-to webinar control panel right on the right of your screen. So a little button looks like a hand. If you would click that and let us know if you actually attended last week's webinar. I noticed a few of you responding already. Quite a few of you actually were able to attend that. So we'll just give you another few seconds there, and great, thank you for that information. That helps us. A few of you, looks like you did not attend last week's webinar, and if you're one of those people, I do encourage you, when it's posted on our website, it shouldn't be long before we have that one up on our website, go ahead and take a look at that one. It'll give you some information about how to set up the GeoCalc component in Geographic Calculator that will apply settings that you can then use in Global Mapper. And again, thanks for responding to that question. Back to today. Before we begin our actual presentation, there are a few issues we need to cover. Josie?
Yes, that's right. All webinar attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, if you'd like to ask us a question, you can use the questions tool on the GoToWebinar panel to the right of the screen. So our Blue Marble product specialists will be able to answer your questions as they're submitted, and we'll also address any outstanding questions at the end of the presentation.
That's right, and as is noted at the bottom of that slide, we have an email address as well, as we always like to let you know. geohelp@bluemarblegeo.com is our help email address. We have folks that are continually monitoring that inbox and hopefully responding to any questions that you send in a timely manner. So if we don't get to your question today, or if you're watching the recording of this webinar and you have a question about some of the functionality we're about to cover, then by all means use that as a method. And I will share that email again with you at the end of today's presentation. A couple of things coming up, Josie.
Yes, in September and October, Blue Marble will be hosting our user conferences in Calgary and Houston. This is a great opportunity for folks to get together in different industries that are all using the Blue Marble applications. So you can network and talk to other people using the products. We'll also be giving away copies of our software as door prizes, so be sure to sign up today. Also, associated with the user conferences is we're offering training, and I'll be hosting the Calgary training. So
that's right, and we're actually going through a lot of preparation for those user group meetings right now. We've got a lot of fun activities, a lot of informative presentations, so truly recommend it if you're in Calgary or in Houston, or if you're planning to be in either of those cities at the times noted on the screen. Go ahead and sign up. Great opportunity to learn more about the software, to speak to some of the folks here at Blue Marble. And if you're in the market for training, my good friend here, Josie, is going to be doing the training in Calgary, so highly recommended that you take a close look at that. The email address, by the way, on the slide will give you more information. www.bluemarblegeo.com/BMUC, Blue Marble User Conference. So hope to see you there. So let's take a look at what we're going to be doing today. First question on my PowerPoint slide is what is GeoCalc. I know there are probably those of you who have signed up for today's webinar because you sign up for all the Global Mapper webinars. You're always interested in getting more information, and maybe you don't know what GeoCalc is. Well, I'm going to begin the presentation today by answering that question. What is GeoCalc, and why should you be interested in it, and why should you consider that as part of your workflow within Global Mapper? By way of kind of putting it in context for those of you who did not have a chance to attend last week's webinar, I will backfill just a little bit, very briefly. Again, I do encourage you, if you weren't at that webinar and it's live broadcast, check out the recording and get the relevant information that my colleague Sam covered during that webinar. But we'll begin today by going into some of the basic administrative settings, just by way of very briefly recapping. We are going to be talking about projection management. GeoCalc is essentially an advanced projection management, a coordinate system management tool within Global Mapper. And to kind of put that in a context, we're going to look at a very high level at projection management in Global Mapper. The various components of the software where you will encounter these dialog boxes. Obviously, when you import certain data types or when you want to reproject, you're going to encounter these settings. And we'll address those. There are many, many different locations within the software where you will encounter those dialog boxes. There is a process for activating this mode within Global Mapper. We'll talk about that. How do we enable this functionality? What are the requirements for this functionality? And how do you get that set up? We will talk about navigating the data source dialog boxes. If you're completely new to the Geographic Calculator way of managing projections, this is obviously not going to mean anything to you at this stage, but the data source dialog boxes are essentially where you're going to make your coordinate system selections. Fairly intuitive, as you'll see. It's not that complicated, and we will certainly talk about how you do that and those processes. We will then go through a couple of workflows. I have 2 or 3 time-dependent, maybe 2 or 3 workflows that I'll actually show you, demonstrating how this application can be used in Global Mapper. How does it differ from the standard installation of Global Mapper as far as the coordinate system management functionality is concerned? One of the bullets I don't have listed here, and this is mostly for those of you who, in attending the Geographic Calculator, are new to Global Mapper. Perhaps you were it was recommended you attend this webinar as a follow-on to last week's. You have not used Global Mapper before. I'm going to go through very briefly, describing what Global Mapper is. Again, for those of you coming from the Geographic Calculator side. So that's the plan of attack for today. As you see, we have a lot to cover, as always. Hopefully, we'll be able to achieve what we want to achieve within the next hour or so. So, addressing that first question on the screen. What is GeoCalc? Well, obviously it's short for Geographic Calculator. It's an abbreviated version of the application that we develop. Blue Marble's flagship product is a product called Geographic Calculator. That product is a geodetic toolkit. Essentially allows you to manage coordinate systems, datums, datum definitions, units of measurement in a very, very precise and very accurate way. The underlying functionality, the underlying technology that's applied in that application is the data source definitions. Basically, defining coordinate systems, defining datums, defining the transformation algorithms. That's what we're going to be integrating into Global Mapper through this component called GeoCalc. As you'll see in a few minutes, it is a module that can be activated. So, to summarize, it's an integration of the key functionality of Geographic Calculator and Global Mapper. It is that kind of overlap, if you like, the bringing together of the two technologies. You get the best of Geographic Calculator combined with the best of Global Mapper. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what those are in just a second. A more kind of expanded definition, it's an advanced projection management tool. Offers access to the largest data set of coordinate system definitions, datum definitions, transformation algorithms that's available today. Specifically looking at the coordinate system definitions, there are about 5,000 definitions that are included in our data source. So if you have been using the reprojection components of Global Mapper, you can see already that this is a much more extensive projection coordinate reference system management system. Now, the definition of GeoCalc, or the definition of this functionality, of the benefit of this functionality, is going to vary depending on which side of the fence you find yourself on. If you are a Geographic Calculator user, well, let me go off on a tangent here and say, first of all, welcome to the Global Mapper side. Thank you for joining us in our monthly Global Mapper webinar. But if you're a Geographic Calculator user, what benefit does this bring? Well, you will still get the full array of calculator reprojection capabilities, the projection management tools, but you will have these functions integrated into a very robust and fully functional GIS application that allows you to do much more in terms of analysis, visualization, etc., etc., etc. Global Mapper is a fully functional, robust application in and of itself, and as a Geographic Calculator user, you can utilize those functions as well as performing the same projection calculations as you were before. So that's for the calculator users. If you're a Global Mapper user, well, why should you be interested in this? Well, it obviously significantly improves projection and coordinate system functions of the software. So regardless of which two applications, which of our two major applications you're coming from, there are benefits in looking at this functionality. I should mention, and I put this in my notes at the last minute, and put a little star beside it so I wouldn't forget to mention this. The integration of GeoCalc into Global Mapper is not considered a replacement for the Geographic Calculator. This is not going to eliminate your need to use Geographic Calculator. Geographic Calculator is an excellent tool for those of you who use it, for doing point database conversions, for working with seismic survey data, and for simple interactive conversions. Those functions do not go away. In fact, those functions are something you will still want to use. The benefit of using the Global Mapper interface is the file formats. Global Mapper supports, we're getting up to 250 formats of data. Applying the same geographic calculation processes to those files are why you'll want to consider the GeoCalc mode. I have another note here, requirements. What do we need to get this running? I've, at a broad level, introduced the technology, but what's required here? Well, obviously, you have to have the current version of Global Mapper. We're up to version 15 right now. You also need to have a licensed version of Geographic Calculator, and the most recent version of Geographic Calculator is 2014. Those two tools, those two components, those two applications work together to allow you to perform these calculations. Both must be licensed. You might have to have licensed versions of both. However, Calculator does not need to be running. I had one person ask me, I think after the last webinar that we did, I was approached and said, do we need to have both applications running? Well, no, you don't. Calculator, the engine or the data source essentially that drives the calculation does not need to be functioning within Geographic Calculator. Global Mapper will access that data. So with that, let's take a quick review of the Geographic Calculator. And again, speaking to those of you who perhaps have not used this tool before, this is an introduction to Blue Marble's flagship product. The interface you see here is essentially how you can convert, reproject, transform coordinate values, X and Y values essentially. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is what we refer to as our interactive conversion. I'm not going to go through that right now, but a little bit later I'm going to be back in this application again, and I'll show you what triggers the use of this tool within Global Mapper. But just for the time being, the way this works, we define an input set of coordinates, an input system, an output system, essentially the target system, and it will, after I select calculate, define the coordinate values in the system I have selected. If there's a transformation required, if you're shifting from one datum to another, you will also select a transformation method. So basically it's almost like going around in a circle. We start with input, define the input, define the transformation, define the output, and we get the results. And this is just one of the types of applications. These are called jobs within the context of Calculator. This particular job lets me simply change one set of values to another set of values, a single point in other words. On the left side of my screen, we can also perform the same types of calculations on a database of points, or on specifically some seismic survey data, or in various other types of data that you can import. Now, The key component of the calculator as far as the use of GeoCalc and Global Mapper is concerned is the data source. We obviously are not going to see this interface in the context of Global Mapper. That does not replicate itself. However, the underlying information, what's under the hood, so to speak, or under the bonnet, is the data source. And from my menu at the top of the screen, I'm just going to very briefly click on this data source menu. And you'll see the definitions that are defined in here. I'm not going to go any further into the menus. If you want some more information on these, certainly go back and look at the webinar from last week, or even indeed any of the Geographic Calculator webinars that have been produced in the past. But this basically provides a list of definitions for things like coordinate systems, transformations, datum definitions, and each of these are defined. We will see these in a different context a little bit later. But this is the core of Geographic Calculator. What I want to show you very briefly now are some of the settings you can apply in Geographic Calculator that will have a consequence in Global Mapper when GeoCalc is enabled. And for this, what I want to do is I'm actually going to go to the administrative settings area of the application. Again, Sam covered this in much more detail during his webinar last week. I'm going to go very specifically to a filtering tool. Now, as you'll see, this is a similar window to what we saw in that menu where we have our units, our systems, our transformations all listed. But in this case, they're expandable. I'm going to select what's perhaps the most common data source component, which is our coordinate systems. I'll just click the little arrow next to it and it'll expand that. And you'll see how these are organized. Within our coordinate systems, there are geocentric, they are geodetic, they're projected. There are vertical coordinate systems as well included in here. This window allows me, as the title at the top says, to filter these. I'm going to strongly encourage you, if you're interested in embarking on this projection management system in Global Mapper, spend some time filtering the systems. Now, if I click all on my coordinate systems, you will see a very extensive list of coordinate systems that are available. Scroll down the list and you'll see that this goes into the, as I said before, the thousands, over 5,000 coordinate system definitions. I'm assuming that most people during their daily tasks, during the workflow that you follow, you will not need most of these. So you can remove them, you can filter them, you can essentially limit the visibility just to those systems that you use. Now, this actually provides a much more efficient way to be able to select coordinate systems, datum transformations when we get into Global Mapper. I'm going to show you an example of that filtering process right now, and hopefully if I remember when we actually launch Global Mapper in a few minutes, I'll show you the consequences of what I'm just about to do. I've expanded my projected systems. And under my projected systems, you'll see how they're organized. Geographically or geopolitically, we define the continental level. Africa, for instance, then has the countries within Africa. You'll notice Antarctica and the Arctic. I want to take Antarctica as my example. Now, let's assume I'm working in North America. I have no need to address or to use the Antarctica systems. If I select that category, you'll see checkboxes beside each of these systems that allow me to check or uncheck as needed. So I can selectively choose which of these I need. Well, in the case of my workflow, given that I'm here in North America, I don't need any of these. So I even have the option not just of deselecting within this list, but I can actually right-click and hide the folder completely. So I will not even see the Antarctica section. When I go into selecting my projections within Global Mapper, Antarctica will not even be available to me because I don't need it. So the italicized name implies that although it's still in the data source, it's not going to be visible to me. And again, as I said, we can selectively turn these on and off as needed. There are tools at the bottom for selecting all, deselecting all, etc. as well. We'll just leave that as is, as an example. We'll click OK, and hopefully, if I remember, we will take a look at that a little bit later. I'm going to save this setting. We'll click OK to get out of the administrative settings, and I'll close the application. Now, one thing you'll notice when I close the application, it wants to save my changes in a workspace. Those of you who have not used Calculator, Workspace is the essential file management system within the application. In order for my setting to be applied in a Global Mapper, I will need to save that to my workspace. So I'm going to say yes in this case. Now, again, that's as far as I'm going to go with Geographic Calculator today. If you want more information, as I said before, backfill and look at the webinar from last week. Okay, Now, if I had assigned that filter during a normal workflow within Global Mapper, I would have to restart, which essentially I've done just now. What I've done is loaded Global Mapper from scratch. So any settings that I would have applied are now applied in Global Mapper in the GeoCalc mode, as we'll see in just a little bit. So if you're halfway through a workflow and you make a change to that filtering process, you will not see that in real time until the application is restarted. So this next section, very briefly, is for those of you who are primarily Geographic Calculator users. This is Global Mapper. Welcome to Global Mapper. This is our desktop GIS application. Supports over 250 file formats, as I mentioned previously. It's got a slew of analysis capabilities where you can do a lot of really neat things with your data. We're working a lot with some of the 3D components now. We have a full suite of digitizer tools for creating and editing features. So this is a very, very, very powerful desktop GIS application, which, as you will see, can integrate the projection management from Geographic Calculator. Before I go any further, what I would like to do, as has become the norm in our webinars, is to conduct a poll. We had a show of hands previously to find out who of you had attended last week's webinar. I'm going to get a little more information from you now. What I'd like to do is ask you which Blue Marble application you are currently using. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. You should see that on your screen. So again, we're assuming that there are people here from the Global Mapper side, people here who are Geographic Calculator users. Some of you, I hope, are using both, and perhaps some of you are using neither. We're starting to see those results coming in. I have to tell you, just looking at the results as they're coming in, there's some interesting results here. I will give you another few seconds, and I will close the poll, and we will turn around and share the results with you. This is actually very interesting, as hopefully you will just see in just a second. Okay, we're going to close that poll. Thank you for your participation. And if I click another button here, it will allow me to share the results. So on your screen right now, interestingly, there are no single Geographic Calculator users out there. We didn't appeal to any of you who are simply Geographic Calculator users. A lot of you are using Global Mapper alone. Obviously, over 2/3 of you have not used Geographic Calculator. A small percentage are using both, and gosh, a quarter of you are using neither. Well, hopefully, again, this will be useful to those of you who are not using either application. I do encourage you that 23% of you are using neither. Go back and take a look at some of the other webinars that define the core functionality of both Global Mapper and Geographic Calculator. We're obviously being very specific today looking at the integration of these two tools, but you'll find there's a lot of value in some of the other webinars as well. So thank you for your participation in the poll. So, Global Mapper. Let's talk projection in Global Mapper, projection management. Taking a step back, everything in Global Mapper, everything that we do in Global Mapper, all the workflows are based on location. They are geographically intelligent, is a term I often like to use. Projection management comes up in multiple areas of the software. And before I integrate GeoCalc, I want to address those components of the software so that we can see the difference when GeoCalc is enabled. First thing that we very often encounter as far as projection is concerned is when we import a layer. And I'm just going to very quickly import a simple layer. Let me back up very quickly, and I'm going to go to a very simple shapefile, and we'll go ahead and import it. Now, on my map, you'll see the rendering of a boundary file of the towns in the state of Maine. Those of you who have been to webinars in the past will know that we use this file quite a lot. In order for this to be rendered in the context of Global Mapper, it needs to have an embedded defined set of locational parameters, essentially a coordinate reference system. I wasn't prompted for that during the import process. That was associated with the file I imported through a projection file. So there was no manual input. But the information, the location information for this file is noted in the status bar at the bottom of my screen. You'll see where my cursor is right at the bottom. You'll see the State Plane Coordinate System, SPCS, is defined. So each of the vertices that define the bounds of each of the towns in this layer have a XY value that adheres to the State Plane Coordinate System and the datum NAD83. I didn't have any required input there. Now, everything that I do within Global Mapper with this layer in place will adhere to that system. If I use the digitizer and I draw some features, I'll go very quickly scribble on the map. That digitized feature, the vertices that I use to create that feature also adhere to the state plane coordinate system NAT83. This happens to be main zone west, I believe, as well. Any additional layers that I import, so if I was to import perhaps data from another source that's perhaps referenced to another system, it will be reprojected on the fly to adhere to that system. Now that's a very important consideration. Global Mapper, and indeed any application, can only have one active projection for display purposes. And Global Mapper defines that projection through that initial setting, and the setting in this case was established by the first layer that I imported. Now again, we have a brief summary of the projection parameters at the bottom of my screen. Another location where we can see that projection information is in the metadata area. In the Overlay Control Center, if I click metadata, we have a projection tab. And the projection tab confirms what I said before. It's a state plane coordinate system, main west, NAT83. Now, this dialog box is for information only. There's no editing capability here. I can make any changes. I certainly am not going to reproject using this dialog box. It's just, as I said, an informational dialog box. That's another place where we're seeing that coordinate information. Another location where we'll see the same information, if I click the options for the selected layer, you will also notice a layer projection tab. Now, this layer projection tab has significantly different consequences from what we saw before, which is simply the visibility of the projection, the view of the projection parameters. And there's a warning that will pop up. This warning does not go away, by the way, in spite of what we imply. You will always see this dialog box for good reason, because this dialog box allows me to change the projection parameters in such a way that Global Mapper reinterprets all of the X and Y values to be in a different system. So if I changed main west to some other, maybe Texas north system, all of my points would be physically relocated to somewhere in the north part of Texas. So this is a very drastic setting. Don't use this for projection. That's the bottom line. And the warning dialog box has told you that as well. There are certain situations where this will be applicable. And if time permits a little bit later, I will show you where this will be applied. Other locations where you will encounter the selection box for projections when you import an ASCII file, a text file. We'll do that a little bit later. You have to define what the X's and Y's are in that ASCII file or that text file. If you perform a rectification process, a rectification is a procedure whereby you assign lat long or XY values to a image file to allow it to be positioned geographically. In order to manually add those, you have to define projection. We have a coordinate converter. Maybe some of you aren't aware of this, but a little coordinate converter tool in the application that lets you define X and Y. So this is another location where coordinates come to play. We have a batch converter. I'm not going to go there, just show you where it is. That again is an area of the software where you will have to address the projection management capability, etc., etc., etc. Those are just some examples. Virtually every component of Global Mapper has a tie-in to the projection management tools within the software. Now, I introduced that at a high level. For those of you who have never seen Global Mapper, obviously, this is going in very specifically. But I want to put into context what we're about to change, because we're going to change significantly the way that you interact with those dialog boxes. We're going to essentially activate a more advanced projection capability within the software. I'm just going to unload my map. Let's try that one more time. And we'll not save our workspace in this case. Okay. In order for you to create that tie between Global Mapper and Geographic Calculator, there are a couple of steps you need to take. The first step is to essentially activate a module within the software called Global Energy Mapper. Now, those of you who have been along the Global Mapper path with us for some time will be aware of Global Energy Mapper, the parallel product. This procedure, the Global Energy Mapper, is in a state of change right now. We will be readdressing this issue in coming releases. But for the time being, if this is something you're interested in doing today, you'll need to activate what we call GEM, which is Global Energy Mapper. And as I said, this is constantly changing. With future releases, you'll probably find a different implementation of this type of functionality. If you do not have GEM, you can get it from our sales guys. I'll give you an email address at the end of the presentation that you can get a license that will allow you to use this. There's no cost for this, by the way. So if you're using the standard version of Global Mapper, you can activate GEM with an appropriate license. And what I'm going to do right now is activate my GEM module. Most of you who have used Global Mapper will be familiar with this window. This is how you activate the software. If you just download it, you'll be prompted with this window to register it. Many options in here. Entering your order number will activate it based on the the fact that you've actually purchased the appropriate license. You can connect to a network license server, or you can connect to a license file, and that's what I'm going to do right now. I'll click the Register Me button, and I'll try to remember where I put my license. I try to keep myself organized. Let's go in here, and I have my GEM license. And basically that's it. Now, how do I know that's changed? How do I know that's active? Well, obviously the checkbox in the extension manager is now checked, but also in the toolbar you'll notice a note that the GEM plus GEM, in other words, the GEM license is now activated. In order to create the tie-in between Geographic Calculator and Global Mapper, GEM needs to be activated. So again, if you want to perform these functions, if you're a calculator user, but you've got the standard version of Global Mapper, again, talk to our sales folks. We'll get you a GEM license that will allow you to do this. So that's step one in terms of activating GeoCalc mode. The second step is actually a configuration option, because out of the box, the projection parameter, the projection management system has not changed. What I need to do now is actually in the configuration dialog box. Global Mapper by default is configured to manage the projection parameters based on the settings that are delivered with the software, basically. But under the general tab of the configuration dialog box, if we scroll down in this list of options towards the bottom, you'll see an option called GeoCalc. Turn on GeoCalc mode. And as you'll see, it gives me a warning that the application will restart. In order to activate this module, GeoCalc mode requires the application restart. I should mention, if you're halfway through a procedure or workflow, make sure you save the workspace. It will warn you, obviously, but make sure that you're aware of that. The restarting application will result in you losing your edits or changes if you do not save the workspace. So we'll go ahead and check that box. There is a second box here to auto-select. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. I want to also draw your attention to the projection tab here. It's called Projection. There will be a change in this when we activate GeoCalc mode. You'll see this will actually have a different name. That's all I need to do. I'll click OK, and by confirming it's, as I suggested, it's asking me if I want to restart, and I'll click OK, and it will actually restart itself. And you'll bring the application back up. In the initial interface, there's nothing immediately visible that tells you that projection management system has changed. However, when I open configuration again, you'll notice it now says GeoCalc Projection. I have enabled the GeoCalc Projection capability. And if I click on that tab, again, you'll notice differences in the way the interface is represented. I'm going to get to this in just a little bit and go through and help you navigate some of the settings that are available in here. In fact, with that in mind, let's go ahead and load up the file that we had just a minute ago. I'm going to bring up my main towns layer just one more time. And we'll go back into the configuration dialog box, and we will see a confirmation of the projection parameters, as we saw in the old system when we loaded this file previously. It's a NAD28 main west zone, which is our state plane coordinate system zone. The datum is defined here, as are the units of measurement. In this case, we don't have a vertical reference system. This is not 3D data. There is no Z or Z value, but it's defaulted to ellipsoidal height if there was a Z value here. Okay, so along the edge of this dialog box, there's a number of actions can be taken. I'm going to start over on the right side. You'll notice the information button. For all of the coordinate systems, all of the datums, all of the units of measure, you can access information. You can access detailed information about that system. This is another window into some of the data source components. The definition of this system, the area of use, well, it's a main in the area of main. Again, an information button lets me get information about that component as well, the area of use. The definition, the coordinate values that define the area of use of that system. You can see we're getting down to a very fine level of information about this particular component of my system. And we can even view a polygon, which shows us the extent of the main west zone. So these are EPSG area of use polygons. We're going to get back to discussing EPSG a little bit later, but as you can see, very precisely, I can get information about the system that I didn't make a selection. This was actually inherited from the file that I imported, but it's telling me in a lot of detail where this system is applicable, all of the other geographic parameters, identification information. I'll close this and actually look at identification in the previous window. Identification includes a set of codes that are assigned to this system. Included in those codes is what's called the EPSG. European Petroleum Survey Group is what that stands for. It's actually a registry of coordinate system definitions, datum definitions, transformation definitions, all assigned a unique code. Now that's an extremely useful tool, because if you have access to the database of codes, your datum transformation, your coordinate reprojection process can simply be initiated by entering a code. And I'm actually going to do that in just a little bit. I'm going to reproject some data using an EPSG code. I noted down the website here, and you can also Google it, by the way, or use whatever search engine you want to. EPSG Registry, I think it's EPSG-registry.org is the organization. It's actually run now by the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers, the OGP, will be the organization that's noted on that website. If you're using some well-defined coordinate systems, EPSG codes have been assigned to them. The reprojection process is simply a case of typing in those values. So a lot of people's workflow involves just simply having a note with all of those appropriate EPSG codes. Reprojecting is very simple based on that. So again, identifiers, not just EPSG, but other identifiers are noted in here. And any remarks, any information about that system. This is just an informational window. And we'll close that. So that was just one information dialog box for one component of our system. And obviously that's not needed for workflow, but a lot more detail as to the parameters of that system. Now, in my case, what I want to do is I want to change this system. I want to change the coordinate system to be UTM. Those of you who are familiar with the basics of coordinate reference systems and projections, hopefully will be familiar with UTM, a worldwide system. The UTM zone that covers this area is zone 19 here in Maine. So what I want to do is I want to reproject this file. I should say as well, just by way of maybe re-emphasizing this workflow in Global Mapper, the reprojection process is initiated from the configuration dialog box. By reprojecting, I am essentially assigning a different X and Y to each of the vertices, but maintaining the location of each of those. I'm not changing where they belong. Now, the reason I bring that up, the previous projection dialog box I showed you with the warning, that is much more drastic because it actually changes and moves the points to a new location. So that's not the reprojection capability. It's in the configuration dialog box where we will reproject. So I'm going to click on the ellipse button right next to my projection information. And again, we get a window into the data source dialog box. Had I filtered this list down into just those that pertain to the state of Maine, perhaps UTM, perhaps the two state plane coordinate system zones, I would have a very finite list here. My selection process could be filtered again using the administrative tools in Geographic Calculator to reflect just what systems that I use. You will notice by default when I access this dialog box, the currently active system is automatically selected, the Maine West system. I'm going to change that. And I'm going to change this to another projected system. In order to show this, I'm actually going to collapse all the menus and we'll start from scratch. This window, as we saw back in Geographic Calculator, shows essentially the different projection systems defined by their type, the geodetic and the projected. Click the arrow buttons to expose the different types. You will notice they're, as I said before, they're subdivided geographically. We have actually elevated UTM to be its own category as well because of the importance of UTM. And if I click the arrow button next to UTM, we've even elevated the WGS84 version of UTM as its own entity. A little space there at the start jumps it to the top of the list, so it's the easiest one to select. I can select then from all of the zones, and I want to choose zone 19 right in here. Now, the other way that we could have done this, by the way, is to run a search. Our find would allow us to search by name, by geodetic, by datum, units, by type, and you'll notice at the bottom EPSG code is also in here. We'll get back to that one, as I said, in a little bit. We'll actually perform a transformation using an EPSG code. We also have the option to choose from the recent list. Now, I've done a few workflows before since I've installed the software, and you'll notice my recent list has been populated. So if you don't actually apply filtering, this is a filtering process in and of itself because it will remember the selections that you have made previously. So again, I have the option because I selected the WGS84 UTM zone 19. Actually, it's not in here, but I could have selected that in this dialog box as well. So multiple ways of honing in and defining the projection parameters. I'm going to go back to where I was previously. Now, before we continue with this process, I should show you at the bottom of my screen the current projection, Maine West, North American Datum, 1983. What we're selecting here is actually WGS84. So not only are we changing the system from state plane to UTM, but we're defining these points based on a different datum. So I'm going to click OK on this dialog box for now, and I immediately get a prompt to choose the transformation definition. Now, because if you remember back to my configuration dialog box, my initial enabling of GeoCalc, I did not include the option which was right below. Now, the option right below would automatically have chosen the most accurate transformation method. Normally, that's what you'll want to do. Allow Global Mapper or the GeoCalc engine to decide what the best transformation method is. For those of you who are just Global Mapper users, maybe not into more advanced geodesy, this can be very complicated. The process of transforming from one datum to another typically involves very complicated math, multiple parameters. You do not need to worry about this if you're defining your transformations based on simply your own requirements. In fact, even within the application itself, we provide accuracy indications as to which of the transformation processes is going to be the most accurate in your case. These are actually units of measure, and the fact that there are multiple means that the transformation actually goes through several steps. NAD 27, NAD 83, NAD 83, NAD 27. So it is a multiple step process. Again, you don't need to look at see this dialog box if you enable that auto select to the most accurate. And I'm going to do that in just a second. Now, in my case, I'm just going to choose the USA, continental US, and you'll see when I select that, the area of applicability of that system. So you can get an idea as to where it's appropriate. You will notice some Canadian systems are included in here as well. A simple reason for that is because I'm within a threshold value of the Canadian border here in the Northeast US. So that's another applicable system that I could choose. We'll just choose that one. We'll click OK, and we'll click OK again. Now, when I select the OK button or click the OK button, you will see a small little shift in the appearance of the outline of the towns. I'll just click OK, and a very slight change. Basically, what we've done is reprojected them, defined this based on a different projection. We haven't changed anything drastically within the data itself. We've simply reprojected. And if my workflow required me to send this back to my client or pass it on to one of my colleagues, the next step in the process is going to be an export process. I should mention, and this is a workflow component of Global Mapper, kind of on a general level, by changing the projection for the visibility of this layer, I have not changed the source file. I have not changed the projection parameters for the original shapefile I imported. In order to apply that, I would need to export it. So your workflow is apply whatever reprojection parameters you want, then export. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to do that part of the process. Fairly straightforward. File, and then export, and you can export that shapefile. And we will go ahead and show you another workflow. I'm going to wipe the slate clean, remove the existing map data. Before I bring in another file, I'm going to go back to the configuration dialog box again. Back in the general tab where I initially enabled the GeoCalc mode, again towards the bottom of this list, the option to auto select the most accurate transform. I will now select that. Previously, when I reprojected the main towns layer, I was prompted to choose that transformation method. A little intimidating for those of you who are maybe not familiar with the advanced math. Let Global Mapper do the work for you. So you can go ahead and select that. Normally that's what you'll want to do. And click OK. No restart needed for that setting. That will automatically be applied. So I will no longer see that transformation dialog box. Any transformation from one datum to another will be applied automatically. Let's go ahead and load up another file here. I believe I have a workspace. Actually, no, I don't. Let me try that one more time. I'll just bring in file using the manual way. This is an imagery file. This happens to be a little further south from where we are right now. This is down in Boston. And confirming the projection parameters for this file, if I open the Overlay Control Center, go to Metadata, I'll go ahead and check the GeoCalc projection. Once again, you will see the dialog box is different than what we saw previously. It doesn't list it in the old global mapper format, but essentially shows you the same information, but within the context of the GeoCalc dialog box. Once again, this is not editable. This metadata is simply for display only, but I can confirm that this is WGS 84 UTM Zone 19 North in this case. So let's take another workflow. Let's pretend in this workflow I want to reproject this to the state plane coordinate system for the state of Massachusetts. I believe there are two zones. One is the offshore and one is the onshore zone. I want to reproject this to the state plane onshore zone. And we'll go ahead and run that reprojection. Again, reprojection is initiated from the configuration dialog box, and you'll see the GeoCalc projection. Same information we saw a minute ago, but in this case, it is now editable. These variables are selectable. We'll go ahead and click the ellipse button once again, and again, we're faced with the same dialog box before, with the current projection automatically selected. Now, in this case, I'm going to use an EPSG code to locate the projection information for the target system. In order for me to conduct this search, by the way, this is just as an FYI, the find function will default to the what's currently selected, so it's not going to work if you maintain that selection. I'm going to go all the way to the top of the list, and I'm going to choose all, and then I can conduct my search. Actually, coordinate systems will go all the way to the very top. So now my find is active, and I can define what it is I want to find. Now, looking at my notes, the EPSG code for the state plane coordinate system, Massachusetts mainland system, if I'm reading my notes correctly, is 2249. So all I need to do is type that numeric code in here, define that as an EPSG code search, and crossing my fingers, I'll click the search button, and that has been confirmed. It's right up here at the top of the list. So I have honed in on specifically the projection I need just simply by typing in 4 characters. Sometimes the EPSG codes are 5 characters, but as you can see, it makes the selection process much more simple. I don't have to browse through multiple menus or to look for variations on the different projections. If an EPSG code is assigned to specifically the system that you need, just go right to that system, click OK, and you'll see that information again confirmed in this dialog box. We'll click OK on this one. And again, there was a transformation required because I changed datum, but I didn't get prompted that time. And the reason I didn't get prompted is because I had that auto select on it. Again, you will have seen a slight change in the alignment. In this case, you'll see the alignment of the image is offset slightly. People often say, is that wrong? That image is wrong. It's not wrong. There's nothing incorrect about this image. It has simply been reprojected in a different way. The X and Y values are still accurate. It's just projected using a different system. Now, I mentioned before that the first file that you import, basically that first data layer that you bring into Global Mapper, essentially defines the projection parameters. Obviously, we know now in the configuration dialog box, we can change that. We can modify that. Even though my initial visible projection was the UTM Zone 19, I have changed that. So going forward, every layer that I bring in from here going forward will be reprojected to the Massachusetts mainland projection. And indeed, any digitized features that I create, let's say I'm using this now to delineate, maybe building footprints or outlining the roads or somehow drawing some features on the map. Any of these digitized functions by default will adhere to the newly selected system. I'll just create an area. Hard to see it on my map, but that area feature, as you can see with the system displayed at the bottom of the screen, will also have X and Y values that adhere to the Massachusetts mainland system. So that initial setting, although it's established by that first file that you import, can be changed. Or indeed, if you start with a blank slate, it's not normal that you start digitizing with no map data for reference, but if you do, start with a blank slate, you can predefine what that projection is and what those X's and Y's are going to be prior to initiating a digitizing process. Once again, the file that I changed, the imagery file, has not been modified. Its original projection is still intact. The source file has not been changed. In order for me to change that, I go through an export process. So as you can see, we're getting kind of repetitive here in our workflow. Import, reproject, export is the normal workflow. Let's take a look at another scenario and another instance where you're going to encounter those GeoCalc dialog boxes. Let me again remove the data that's currently on my map. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a text file. And I usually, if I have time, I'll actually show you what the text file looks like. The clock is kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to do this very quickly. I'm actually going to import the file. Take my word for it. The file is simply two columns, one being the easting and one being the northing. And these eastings and northing values, these x's and y's, are UTM coordinates. So I'm going to go ahead and open that ASCII file. And we'll go to the Kennebec County file, and we'll click Open. Those of you who use Global Mapper and have worked with text data will be familiar with this window. This is how we tell Global Mapper what the settings for this file are. In my case, I'm going to bring in areas. I'm going to actually make sure that those areas are closed. It's going to be a polygon that's going to be created. So all of the settings pertaining to that file, whether there's any fields to this information, if I want to assign them to a feature type after they're imported, all of these can be established here. What's not in this dialog box is a method for interpreting what the x's and y's are. It's just a text file that I'm importing. Global Mapper is not smart enough to know what those x and y's are. They could pertain to any number of systems. So what we're going to see after we click OK on this dialog box is the same GeoCalc projection dialog, allowing us now to specify what those x's and y's are. Now, if I choose the wrong system, the file will import correctly, but it'll be in the wrong location. Now, I'm going to do that on purpose. This is obviously something I'm going to do in my controlled environment. Do not do this yourself. I happen to know that this file is a UTM file, zone 19, but I want to choose zone 18. And I'll click OK. Now again, there's going to be no error here. It's not going to warn me that I've chosen the wrong system. It doesn't know. It doesn't know that those settings are correct. But the consequence of me choosing the wrong zone, if I click OK, I think everything else should be fine, is that this file is in the wrong location. Now, to prove my point, I'm going to bring in the main towns layer I had previously, and you'll see this county boundary actually is where I'm sitting right now, somewhere over here in central Maine. It's obviously in the wrong location. I made the wrong selection. Global Mapper, as I said, did not know that. So here's a situation where we can activate the GeoCalc editing tool that you access for that particular layer. Now, once again, I showed you this before, and I gave you due warning that you do not use this dialog box for reprojection, as is confirmed in the warning. Do not reproject using this system. Well, I won't, but instead what I'm going to use this for now is to reinterpret the x's and y's that are embedded in this object that I've imported. I misrepresented the zone. I can change that now. And basically, same dialog box again, this time zone 19 north, and we'll simply click OK. Now, I'll just move this out of the way slightly so we can see the results. When I click Apply, it's going to be hard to see. The boundary of the county is going to shift right into the correct location. And to prove my point, let's go ahead and we'll close the window, and I'll turn off the towns, and there we see that's exactly where it should belong. So there's another application of the projection tool. As I said, don't use that tool for reprojection, but you can certainly reinterpret those values in the event that you make a mistake. That's the only instance that you would typically use that type of application. To this point, we have talked about three variations on the theme of dealing with horizontal coordinate reference systems or horizontal projection information. What we're going to do very briefly here, and this will probably be where we'll wrap up today, we're going to take a look at some of the vertical functionality that's brought to play with the GeoCalc mode. And for this, I'm going to bring in some LiDAR data. While I'm loading up this file, those of you who have not use LiDAR, not familiar with LiDAR, it is a point data set. It's a series of points with an X, Y, and a Z value or a Z value that can be used to generate a terrain surface. I'm trying to multitask here. There we go. And we will click OK. And I'll just go ahead and bring in all of my points. In this case, that's fine. I have applied a filter, so I'm actually going to see all of them. That's okay. In this case, you'll see an array of points colorized by elevation. So here we have a situation where each point has an x and a y. In the horizontal plane, on a two-dimensional framework, it has an x and a y, in this case pertaining to, again, UTM zone 19, which we've used quite a lot. But these points also have a z value or a z value. They have an elevation. If I use a feature info tool in the application, you'll see there is an elevation value. Well, you may have noticed in the projection dialog box, we also now have the ability to define the vertical coordinate system, or to reproject from a vertical coordinate system to another vertical system. Now, needless to say, if you're not working with elevation data, with three-dimensional data, with data that has that third dimension with the z value, don't worry about this. This is not going to be applicable. But if you're working with LiDAR, working with terrain data, this is something you now have available with this combination of Global Mapper and Geographic Calculator. You can now perform some very high-end vertical transformations as well. Procedure is exactly the same. In this case, I'm going to reproject to the North American Vertical Datum 1988, and I do it exactly the same way I would have previously. One thing to note here, let me actually open up one of these menus. We'll choose the United States, actually. Let's choose a different area. I'm looking for something that I found recently. Let me describe, I guess. If you have not use the vertical systems, you may see some of these items are actually red. I believe I've actually enabled quite a few. But if these vertical systems are red, it means the actual algorithms, the tables that are required for those transformations have not been installed with the software. And you will have the option to right-click and download those. That's certainly an option. The Global Mapper view actually contains that filtered list. That's why I'm not seeing those systems, but you can download them. There's a right click to download the missing systems. It will download those files in real time and make those available to you. So if you're counting those kind of red line items, it is an easy solution. Simply right click and there would be an option to download. In my case, I'm going to choose the NAVD88 and we'll simply click OK. And we'll click OK again. By the way, before I do get out of this dialog box, you will notice at the bottom a summary of the transformation. And you'll see this, the transformation parameters are noted down here. We click OK. And I have reprojected my LiDAR data in a vertical sense. And again, export that back out to the .las format, and those projection parameters will be inherited in that file. So there was a couple of other things I had on my notes to show. I'm not going to have time. I apologize. We have reached the top of the hour. One thing I did want to mention, under the Tools menu, we have a coordinate converter. I showed you this briefly at the start, where it brought up a simple little dialog box that allowed you to put in an X and Y value, define the output system, and it'll give you that conversion. Now that we have integrated and enabled the GeoCalc mode, this tool will actually perform this operation in Calculator. Why reinvent the wheel is the logic here. Why would we want to recreate what Geographic Calculator does exceptionally well? So when you activate that tool, when you have GeoCalc enabled, it will automatically load Geographic Calculator, and you can perform those conversions right here in the Geographic Calculator interface. There's no need to have a component of Global Mapper that does this as well. So that is a slight change in the behavior of Global Mapper when you have GeoCalc enabled. So with that, we're going to wrap up for today. Now, I know some of my colleagues have been sitting on the sidelines, hopefully answering any questions that you had. Hopefully you were able to get your questions answered. Apologies, I didn't have a chance to address those myself. If your questions were not answered, as we said previously, we have a couple of avenues. The GeoHelp, bluemarblegeo.com is our 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year portal into our help system. Usually we try to get answers out as soon as they come in. And obviously if our workload is a little heavier, we might take some time, but we try to get onto those questions as soon as they come in. The Global Mapper Forum is another excellent resource, great for peer-to-peer type of learning. So 2 avenues for you to get more information. Again, if you didn't get your question answered today, feel free to email it to us and we'll follow up with you and get those answers you need. One thing I didn't put on this slide was the access to our sales folks. Just noting the email for our global mapper sales folks is GM Orders. And again, at bluemarblegeo.com. GM Orders at bluemarblegeo.com. If you're not currently using Global Energy Mapper and you want to try this out, you want to try this GeoCalc mode out, if you're a calculator user, shoot them an email, tell them your status, they'll give you a new license, and you can certainly go ahead and use those integrated GeoCalc functions within the software. Recording of this webinar will be published hopefully within the next couple of days. It doesn't take us too long to process them. If you have any issues, you need to go back and backfill, you can certainly do that in the recorded version. We have already arranged our webinar for August. Gosh, August already. We're doing a webinar on digitizing, so if you want to see some information on how the digitizer works, some more advanced or hidden digitizer functions, I believe sign up is available. We may not have sent out the email yet, but if you go to our website, I think you should be able to sign up for that webinar. And that about wraps it up for today. Once again, thank you all for attending. Thank you for taking your time out today, and we look forward to speaking with you next month.